Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Innovating for 2030 webinar. My name is Ryan Chen. Today, we'll share our 4 steps to the data-driven customer foresight. I hope it's going to be an enriching webinar for you. So again, good afternoon, everyone. Ryan Chen here. I'm the Director of Design Innovation Strategy at Bruster Group.
And hello, I'm David Levine, VP of Client Solutions for OSG.
Bruster Group is a design innovation consultancy. Our expertise lies in consumer trends and product innovation.
And OSG is a cognitive and behavioral analytics company. We focus on how people think and are motivated and how that type of thinking drives behavior. And we use that type of data and secondary data to predict the future.
So together, we form a very powerful combination to deliver that data-driven customer foresight for you. So let's start with something that's familiar for us. We all know that a product takes anywhere from 3 years to 10 years to develop, from idea to commercialization. However, most companies rely on their understanding of the consumers today, either through generative research or concept testing to make that decision for the future. We know consumers are evolving. This is a risky strategy.
So the question is, how can we gain foresight so that the uncertainties are minimized for the customers of the future, not just for today? How are we thinking about innovation for the longer term?
So today, we'll share why consumer foresight is so important. The 4 steps to develop the consumer foresight. We do have 3 case studies to show how it's being applied, and some of the actions that you can take now to innovate for 2030. Lastly, at the end of the webinar, we do have the Q&A. You can open the question and answer from your Zoom panel and key in any questions you have along the way. So let's start with why is consumer foresight so important? Ask yourself, how many of you have been involved in a failed product innovation? And I can say I have. And it's not the fault of anyone, but just the nature of innovation. In fact, 11 out of 12 startups fail. And depending on sources, as high as 19 out of 20 product innovation will fail. So innovation is a complex and a risky activity, yet it's an essential one. 84% of executives agree that innovation is important for their growth. It's also interesting to note only 6% are satisfied.
And then consider the fact that your customers are constantly changing, and not just in small ways. When we think just in the past decade, we've seen major shifts in public opinion, complete reversals on such issues as legalizing marijuana and same-sex marriage, where within the span of the past 10 years, they've moved from more opposing to more in favor of, and major shifts in technology. So these are not small changes that are happening over time. Your customer is in a constant state of evolution.
Another reason, the technology landscape is changing every day. On the top right, in 2010, only 2 out of 7 largest companies by market cap are in the technology industry. They are indicated in green. However, looking at today, 2020, all 7 out of 7 largest companies are in the technology industry. And moving forward, if we look at the hype curve on the bottom right, how many of emerging tech on the left do we think will be widely adopted in 10 years? According to Amara's law, we tend to overestimate the effects of the technology in the short run and underestimate it in the long run. So we can see in 10 years' time, technologies such as explainable AI, autonomous driving level 5, or edge analytics may have a great impact in 2030. So 10 years is no longer a long amount of time. Think about this. How long did it take for you to start using Uber? 3 years, 2 years, perhaps. In fact, if you look at the chart on the top right, the number of years it takes for each product to gain that initial 50 million user is getting shorter and shorter. 12 years for mobile phone, 4 years for iPod, 2 years for Twitter. The adoption rate is going so fast that there are opinions that McKinsey's 3 horizon model is no longer valid, and that horizon 3 can happen at any time.
And at the same time, it takes a long time to develop a product, a new innovation. If we look at the top 6 obstacles of innovation performance, number 1 is too long development time. It takes a long time to get things right, to see an idea to fruition. And in that time, as technology and your customers are moving, advancing, adopting new things, there's a high risk of being disrupted in that time frame that it takes for development. So the question is, how far out in advance should you be thinking? Do you need to be thinking to be successful when you're finally able to launch your innovation?
So let's all do a simple calculation. Think about a product that you are developing now. If you take X, the number of years it takes to bring your products from idea to the market, plus Y, the number of years you expect your products to be in the market, and you arrive at Z, the minimum number of years you have to plan for the future. And ask yourself, will your customers' behavior remain the same in the Z years? Will your product proposition features still be relevant in that Z years?
And yet, for the most part, as we're thinking about innovation, most companies are thinking only about their current customers today. Why are they doing that? Maybe it's risk aversion. They don't know how to think about the customers of the future, or they feel that perhaps the perception of foresight might be unreliable, or that maybe they can't connect further out predictions to something that they can actually act on in their development roadmap. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today, some practical steps to bring in that foresight perspective, that vision of the customer of the future into the innovation work you're doing today.
So here we go. And before we start, let's first ask ourselves, what is foresight exactly? For us, foresight is different from a prediction, which is an extension of the current situation into a single future. A foresight is an understanding of the range of the plausible futures and the potential surprises. So it gives you all the information you need to develop a responsive strategy.
So what we're encouraging is thinking not just in the near term about understanding our current customers, but developing that long-term consumer foresight. So thinking not just on the customer as they exist today, but understand that there will be a future customer that is different from now. And rather than assuming that the consumer is constant, that of course they will be evolving over time. Instead of thinking about their behavior today, you focus on the drivers influencing consumer behavior today, which is more lasting and predictive. And again, we want to be not just reactive to what is going on in the forces we're seeing, but predictive and proactive and thinking ahead to those potential future scenarios and leading the way.
So this foresight will allow us to develop the right mix of innovation models. And we believe that the best innovators will have the right mix And the mix will include the incremental innovation, where we try to improve an existing solution, or white space innovation, that we try to define a new market, or breakthrough innovation, where we create a radically new and better solution. And lastly, of course, the disruptive innovation. It is difficult to deliver each one of them. However, it is even more difficult to determine what is the right mix. And that's why foresight is so important.
And as you think about those further out into the future end dates, you need to be thinking a little bit differently. So today, consumer research is extremely valuable for telling us what's going on, and it can give us a really far outlook into the future. But the further out you go, you need to get outside of the customer itself and take on broader perspectives using trend analysis, using all sorts of predictive approaches, KOLs, bigger picture understanding of where we think the market might be going, which can feed back into what our customer is telling us to give us that long-term perspective, which we're going to go into more detail on.
So there we go, the 4 steps for data-driven customer foresight. And we start with step 1, analyze, where we try to understand the key consumer drivers and identify the critical uncertainties, basically the unknowns about the future. Then we'll envision and create the scenarios of the future. In step 3, we will test the scenarios and minimize the unknowns and increase our understanding the impact of each scenario. And lastly, strategize, where we translate the foresights into actions. This is where potentially we will have innovation roadmaps, which guides you where you want to play and how to win in the market. While the steps are kind of straightforward, we incorporate data with rigorous analysis so that we can develop an evidence-based foresight. And we'll show that in the next few slides. In the first step, we start with analyze. Here, we aim to understand what are the different drivers that influence consumer behaviors in the future. And the drivers are the macro factors, such as societal, technological, cultural, or even environmental factors. They have long-term influence on how consumers shop, live their life in the future. And there's no lack of market reports or the trend reports. But how do we navigate all the different data that we have? At Browser Group, we use a proprietary tool called Consumer Mega Trend that you see in the middle here. It's a 10 trends which we use to identify and understand what are the different consumer involvement in the future. It's a very effective tool to understand and connect to different cues and signals. Take an example of ethical living. This is a trend that we predict sustainability and social responsibility will increasingly becoming important factors in how they eat and how shop in the future. The next step, we'll conduct key opinion leader interview and try to identify any missing gaps.
And it doesn't have to just be these high-level approaches too. We would encourage also looking at data that you have in your company already in a different way, using advanced statistical techniques like regression analysis to understand what are the factors that are contributing to growth and momentum today, and to help see what are those paths moving forward. Really, we want to come to the table here with a robust fact base that we are basing our future predictions on. We're not starting at an empty whiteboard.
So at the end of this step, what we have is significant trends and critical uncertainties. The significant trends are trends that we know the direction and the degree of impact. Aging population is a good example. This is where we have a good confidence on how the population will age and its potential impact. The next thing that we want to have, and perhaps more importantly, is the critical uncertainties. These are the trends that we are not sure of directions or the impact. For example, it's a consumer's attitude towards sustainability. We know that sustainability is going to be more important. However, we don't know exactly the degree of impact in the future. It's important to note that the critical uncertainties are specific to each industry and challenges. So you need to investigate what is your critical uncertainties. In the next step, we will translate the critical uncertainties as a key variables to create a range of plausible future. In this envisioning step, we can look at the top right as an example. Here, we create a healthcare industry example. The 2x2 matrix describes the different availability of resource as one unknown. On the left, you see scenarios that we predict the resources are scarce. On the right are the scenarios where resources are abundant. We also look at the state of the industry. On the top, where the traditional players hold ground, and on the bottom, the new entrants shake out the industry. And these two axes give us 4 different types of scenario. On the top right, consolidation, where the existing players become stronger and grow in power, creating an enclosed ecosystem. On the bottom right, fragmentation. This is where new entrants, such as Apple's, Google's, and new startups, they compete in the same market and offering differentiated services for the consumers. On the top left, transformation. This is a scenario that the current healthcare system is not able to cope with the emerging needs. And that's why we will see a new healthcare system emerge. And lastly, on the bottom left, commoditization. This is where healthcare becomes a commodity, and that a lot of different players will be offering a very standardized solution for the consumers. So each scenario describes the opportunity and the threat. It's important to understand the potential impact of the scenarios. On the bottom right, we illustrate one of the fragmentation scenario. Here, we predict a future where healthcare is offered anytime, anywhere. Things such as autonomous mobile clinic or healthcare integrated in gyms and restaurants become a commonplace. The scenarios is outlined in one of our white paper as well. And lastly, all these scenarios are not just a speculation of the future. They are based on a thorough analysis that we done in the step 1. However, we still want to test them to improve our level of confidence and also to understand the nuances of each scenario. And that's why we'll go to the step 3.
And in step 3 is when we test and refine our understanding of the potential future scenarios. And that's where we do go back to the customer, because the customer really is at the heart of all of this. We just want to understand where the customer is moving and where they may end up in the future. Part of the way to do that is to understand their needs, what matters to them. And when we think about customer needs, we want to think about drivers and motivators. It's not what they're trying to achieve, it's their needs. It's not a product feature. It's not something that's specific to the technology that they have, but it's what's driving them in their thinking, in their decision making today. And at OSG, we use a methodology called ACE-MAP for that. And that lets you look at a large range of motivators, 30, 40, 50, and understand how relatively important they are to each respondent individually. And what is valuable about this approach in particular, because we understand the individual, we can understand what are the challenges people are facing today in a lasting way that's not specifically tethered to the technology, but also because we understand people individually, we can stratify them based on where we expect these different dimensions to play out differently in the future. We can take individuals who currently have access to much more fragmented healthcare options versus those who are really tied to a single option. And by stratifying on that basis, we can see as we move from one end to another end, certain areas, certain motivators become more critical, others fall off. And this lets us understand the impact that you might see differently in scenarios where the world might move one direction to the other. And this also gives some visibility to the potential size of that impact over time as we understand the different groups in the audience, as we understand the different potential future customers based on age, based on where they stand in their own lives. We can get some projections to say, given the different potential futures that might exist, where the biggest opportunities could potentially be. So it's a grounding in real consumer thinking and motivation and choice that provides indications of different potential directions the world might be moving in. There's a link to AceMap if you want to learn more about the methodology itself in the chat box.
In the last step, strategize. This is where we translate the foresight into actionable steps. On the top right, you see one of the examples of the steps, an innovation roadmap. In this roadmap, we have different innovation driving towards a different future, indicated by the downward arrows. While the roadmap may have different outcomes, it's important to note that they are interconnected and can move horizontally, which is allowing us to respond to the different scenarios. In this step, we also want to identify all the potential signposts. The signposts are events that indicate a shift towards one of the future. So on the bottom right, if we take healthcare as an example, increasing cost of the healthcare, economic depression, and drastic decrease in the consumer trust may point towards the breakdown of the healthcare system in the transformation scenario. So here, the outputs include a responsive, a robust innovation strategy, and a list of the signals to watch out for.
So here are our 4 steps. We start by analyzing, envisioning, testing, refining, and strategizing. And what we want to highlight here is this approach is grounded in data at every step along the way. We take the time to analyze so that when we envision, when we coalesce upon a few particular ideas, a few particular dimensions that we see as likely potential defining points of future scenarios, it's grounded in the analysis we've done. It's grounded in broader trends we've identified, in real data that we can look at in statistical analysis. As we strategize, it's based on the strength of what customers can tell us today about what needs are and how those different customers perceive needs to be differently. That way, we have a firm understanding of, as we think about these envisioned futures, what might be the impact to the actual customers along those lines, and helps us to identify what are those sign points we should be looking at. It's a very data-driven and fact-based exercise in thinking about the future customers. It's not, again, it's not a open-ended brainstorming session.
So next, we will show a few case studies how we apply the steps in an actual project. In the first case study, we developed foresight on the future of mobility. And here our client is one of the top automobile B2B manufacturer. They want to transform themselves from an OEM to an industry leader. And they want to do it by look towards the future for guidance on how they can do that. So for this project, Instead of taking a very technological approach that we predict what is the future of, for example, autonomous vehicle or the drone delivery, we actually look at the demand side, who the customer is, what is their needs in the future. And the way we do that, we look at the future of the cities, how the society will evolve, and how that future city scenario will tell us in terms of like the different needs for the mobility. On the top right, we develop 5 city models. Essentially, each model is a scenario of the future. And the models are created based on the path of the economic growth and also the societal values of the cities. So for example, a city model C might be focused on ethical living and social responsibility. Whereas city model B on the left is a planned economy where infrastructural innovation may have a high potential. So each city's growth model is different, and that describes the different unmet and emergent needs. So they gave our client a lot of insight on where the future opportunities are and develop a strategic approach for each of the city model.
Our second example was actually an OSG Bressler Group collaboration looking at future-proofing hospital capital equipment. This is an expensive purchase that is a long-lasting 10 years in an institution type purchase in a competitive environment. So as we're thinking about innovating in a space like this, it's really critical to understand what are those important needs going to be in a longer time frame, and to make sure it creates a lasting competitive advantage. On the top right here, we can look at a framework that may be familiar to many of you, where if we're understanding the importance of specific needs, of things that are motivating me, that are outcomes I'm trying to seek in the jobs that I'm trying to do, we can north-south have the relative importance. So the things that are most important to our customers are towards the top, and east-west are how well my solutions are delivering today. We have that top right quadrant where things are very important, but I'm not happy with how they're working. And these are the areas which offer the key immediate future potential opportunities to differentiate and to add value to our customers today. And in this model, you would typically predict that the bottom right, things that are not well delivered today, but are not really recognized as that important, as the more important ones in the top right become delivered. As these incremental innovations happen, those will shift to the left, the bottom ones will come up. When we take a stratified view of the customer and we see those that are more mature from a technological standpoint in their institution versus less, we can begin to see in real time what happens as you reach more technological maturity in your institution, what becomes more important, what becomes more well delivered. And this gives us a multidimensional way of thinking out into the future in the near term and in the further term about how you can deliver on needs and provide a meaningful differentiation in the market.
So the understanding of how the opportunities will evolve now and into the future allow us to map the different innovations that we have based on the level of effort and the timing. On the bottom right, you see one of the innovation roadmap that we created. We have 5 concept levels, and each level describes the different effort, but also they are mapped to the different opportunities in time. The process allows the clients to make a more informed decision on when and what innovation to pursue, so that they can future-proof their hospital management system and ensure that it continues to meet the customer's needs in the future.
We also have an example in the consumer space where we would think about things pretty differently. So in this particular case, we're talking about a beverage example. And when you think about the customers today and their needs in beverages, we would expect a very different perspective from individuals. So we focus on a needs-based segmentation approach. We have this full, broad understanding of the different drivers that might motivate you in your choice of a beverage, 30, 40, 50 different options. We would group them around similar patterns, similar archetypes of decision-making, when you would think the people who are looking for a health benefit versus the highest quality, things that you can nucleate around, that you can get an understanding of a relatively consistent group within that market that you can innovate to and that you can message to. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this approach. With AceMap, you actually have a pretty robust picture of what future innovation might look like for each of these audiences, because you have a large number of needs and a relative sense of how well delivered they are for each of these groups. We can bring in our perspectives of long-term trends, of where different potential futures are taking us, to see where these groups might be moving, which groups might be growing, which groups might be smaller, shrinking, and then as trends change over time, looking within these groups, looking at these differences and stratifying them on those dimensions, we can begin to understand what the future market might look like for what may be small today, but could be very valuable in the future.
So here next, we will look at some of the actions that we can take now to innovate for 2030.
Right, and the first thing we can do is ask ourselves, how far are we looking out into the future as we're making decisions, as we're thinking about customers? How far are we and how far should we? So it's a simple question we can ask ourselves now to get into that mindset. And then think about the research methodologies you're using now and could use now to provide the right foresight. Are you getting a customer perspective on their broad needs as opposed to just specifically what their products are delivering today? Are we taking an evidence base, and are we considering the impact of potential plausible futures as we ask these questions, as we go out to our audiences? Are we thinking about potential surprises that may come along the way? And we can identify gaps in our thinking, and we can open up a lot of new doorways to what we can be considering as we think about innovation.
The second question, ask yourself, are we able to apply the foresight in a meaningful way? So here, we want to consider these 3 points. First, avoid placing a bet on a single future. Or at least, if you want to do that, make an informed decision to do that. Take an example of Kodak. They are actually the inventor of digital photography. However, their innovation strategy did not anticipate the fast adoption rate of digital photography. And that's why they lost out in the competition. Second, we want to develop an innovation strategy that responds to the different futures. And here we are not talking about creating 4 different strategies for the 4 different futures, but one which can adapt to the various possibilities, so that as you move forward in your innovation journey, you can recognize the signpost and adapt accordingly. And that brings us to the last point. Every year, you need to review your foresight and strategy so that you can keep up to date on what is the latest development and identify what is the potential path forward. Last question. How might we achieve a future that is the most rewarding for us? Assuming that you develop the 4 scenarios of the future, and each future will have different impacts and opportunities. Potentially, one of the scenario is more ideal for you. So how can we make that happen? Here are the steps. First, you need to develop your ideal vision of the future. That future taps on your expertise, your competitive advantages. And that future potentially maybe even outside the 4 scenarios of the future. Then you take a step, take a process of backcasting. Basically a process that you try to understand what are the different steps necessary to create the vision of the future that you have. So it could be a strategic or tactical move, such as developing a completely new competitive advantage, or take a lead to demarcate a new industry, or introduce a series of incremental innovations that nudge the consumers towards a certain behavior.
And finally, we can't be talking about the future and potential scenarios in the middle of a pandemic without addressing that. And we just want to say that, you can't predict when a pandemic will happen, but you can develop a robust strategy that is prepared to respond to challenges as they occur, including potentially very surprising and disastrous ones. And for the prepared, COVID-19 can have been a signal towards one of their future visions already. And I think we're seeing very frequently today a lot of people taking a similar approach, recognizing the uncertainty of the next few months and the few years, thinking about strategically what different scenarios might exist. So we feel a very short-term crisis that's forcing us to consider multiple potential futures in the relatively short term. I think this can get us all accustomed to thinking about potential futures and planning for potential futures in the longer term going forward.
So lastly, we envision a future where disruption will become more common than ever. Whether you're in healthcare or consumer goods industries, we all need to think about foresight and how we can develop a forward-looking innovation strategy. Think about your innovation strategy now. Are you reacting to the disruption and hope to respond fast enough when your customer telling you that they need something else? Or are you anticipating the disruption and develop a robust strategy to capture new opportunities? Or perhaps you are leading the disruption and redefining the markets before other people. So it's your choice which path you want to take. And with that, thank you very much for your time. And we will have a Q&A in the next session as well. We do have a few questions coming in.
Yes, and while you are thinking of questions, and please do type them into the Q&A box, and I will ask them so that Ryan and David can answer. But I think we have a couple of slides about some upcoming events here. We wanted to let you know about 2 webinars that we have coming up in the next 2 weeks, and I will post the links to these in the chat. One of them is risk reduction for connected devices with Bressler Group's electrical engineering manager and software engineering manager. And the other one is about a tool that we use for integrated product design called Digital Physical Workflows with our UX Research and Strategy and our Director of Interaction Design. And we also encourage you to sign up for our newsletters and for Bressler Group's newsletters. And there's also a link to learn more about OSG and sign up for their newsletter as well. And again, I'll post those in the chat, and I'll send out all of these links as well as a recording to everybody who signed up for the webinar. So now I will get to the questions. And I think the first one that came in is from Phil Tin. And the question for you, David and Ryan, is how does an organization like Tesla that focuses on pushing the tech and vertical integration look at such demand side analyses?
So I'll start and pass it to Ryan. I mean, I think I can't speak for Tesla specifically, but thinking about other companies that I'm more familiar with, I think we can think of Apple as another one. I think the way I think about it is there's pushing the tech side, which is focused on the possible and growing the possible. I think the demand side is focused on the valuable and understanding what is and might be valuable. And I see these two things working together. And that in a process like this, ideally, we would have a multidisciplinary team that would be thinking both about what is possible and be inspired by the customer and the demand to consider new things that may not have considered, as well as the side focused on marketing and customer understanding, focused on what is and could be valuable and being inspired by what is possible in order to envision more in the future. Ryan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think it's a very relevant question because you have the technological side and you have the demand side, and there might be a gap in between. And I think the understanding of how wide the gap is, or what is that gap, what is the nature of that gap, will allow companies like Tesla to determine how can they bridge their gaps. Potentially is changing their technology solutions towards the demand side, or create a series of either marketing activities or incremental innovations that drive the consumer value towards where they want to be. And that is the process of like vision of future. This is our vision of future. And these are the steps that we can change the consumers, we can change the industry towards that future. Ideally, the sweet spot could be somewhere in between.
Okay. The next question is from Vishal Krishna, and it is, when working in the retail consumer goods environment, which in many cases has a 1 to 2 year update cycle, resulting in lots of wastage on the consumer end, how do we innovate in a sustainable manner?
I can take that first. So we see trends coming in like a short term, mid term, and a long term. So a lot of 1 to 2 year update cycle you're talking about are more of the perhaps the aesthetic or industry trends which change every 2 or 3 years. However, if you have a good understanding of the longer term trends, the mega trends which can last 5 to 10 years, and using that understanding to create what is your short-term tactical move, that will allow you to have more foresight to develop the trends, the 1 2 year cycles that is more relevant and driving towards where the consumer are going in the future.
That's right, and I think there is always an opportunity in seeing those trends to take on a leadership role, as we talked about towards the end, in terms of moving the customer in a direction that has momentum already, but taking the lead to say sustainability is important, and we want to drive towards something sustainable, or if you mean sustainability for your business, I guess you could read it either way. It is with that end state in mind, where we're building toward a future where we are leading the customer along these innovation cycles towards these broader trends, as opposed to being reactive as they come along. So there's wastage, but there's also the sustainability of your own business. So. Right, next question.
Okay. The next question is, in test and refine, how can you test and validate the critical uncertainties with consumers when they are not ready for the future?
So I think the thing to keep in mind that, in my opinion, and Ryan as well, you can take this as well, is we are thinking more about the impact of those futures. So it's not necessarily testing based on, well, what if there was a pandemic and trying to create an artificial scenario of a pandemic, 6 months ago and trying to work around that. It's the impact of a broader trend. What might the state of things look like in the future where you have more disconnected, distributed workforces, where people are more reliant on online communications instead of face-to-face communications, where e-commerce is more the focus as opposed to retail shopping. These were all perfectly predictable things that people had been talking about for a long time. And as we think about what strategically would be impactful in my business in an environment like that, we can look for scenarios, prepared for scenarios that drive us in those directions. And we can think about the types of crises, challenges that might come up, and we can think about what trends would that push us toward faster and away from currently, and think along those lines, not necessarily the immediate impact to an individual psychology of going through a particular challenge.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, consumers, they might not be ready for the future, but what we are really interested in this 4-step approach are the drivers that influence their behavior in the future. So the macro drivers, the societal values, how the environmental value, or the different macro drivers. And these are something that we can also test to make sure that, to understand how these drivers will change and how they will influence the consumers of the future.
Okay, our next question is from Joe Framandi, who says, certainly there are levels of innovation. What you presented is high level, innovating for the duration. Once that work is completed, what's your approach to applying innovation at the here and now product or service development?
Ryan, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I can start it. So the high level innovation for the duration for us is a kind of like a North Star that describes what is the vision that we want to achieve. And by having that North Star, we can kind of like backtrack to understand what is the gap that we have now in terms of our product, in terms of the ideal future. What are the different obstacles that we need to overcome? What are the different important markets that we need to acquire, important competitive advantage, or milestone products that we need to deliver so that we can achieve that future. So for us, by having that high level innovation for the future, it allows us to create a series of incremental innovation in order for us to achieve the future.
Absolutely. The approach we're talking about, really, we're emphasizing that North Star. We're emphasizing having some foresight and perspective on where you think the world will be and what you can do in the long term to prepare for that. The approaches that you take to get there give you very sharp, immediate, precise guidance on the incremental innovations that will be valuable to your customers and offer opportunities for differentiation on the right now. What are those improvements you can make? Where are your competitors strong? Where are they weak? It's all of that tactical guidance. What we're recommending, though, is that it is taken with the bigger picture and the longer term in mind, so that we're moving not just on an incremental step-by-step basis, but towards moving your audience in the direction to this future that works out for you as a company to win and to lead the way forward.
Okay, great. So we have 2 more questions. The first is, there are many research studies about the sentiment of consumers. What kind of different information could we get with your approach, and how it could give stakeholders more actionable insight?
What kind of different information could we get with your approach, and how could it give stakeholders more actionable insights to innovate during the post-COVID era? Is that the...
Yes.
Great. So, and I think the way I think about it, and that is a question that we're answering all the time for a lot of different companies right now. And I think I alluded to this earlier, that we're seeing right now an uncertainty of what the immediate future will look like, and a time when we would expect there to be lots of immediate futures. What the approach in the here and now that we recommend is to take the approach where you're understanding the motivation and the drivers behind decision making. We can understand the way people's behavior has already changed, which is different for me than it is for you and for lots of different people out there. And we can understand the motivators that led them to the decisions that and to the behaviors that they're taking. And that gives us a perspective to say, as things change, as things reopen, as things are fundamentally shifted, or if things go back to a more normal state, where do we expect these people to move into the future? And there's that type of guidance where you understand how the motivation led to the action, gives you a lot of perspective on what specific actions you can take for the customers where you can win with. So it is going to look different depending on the business you're in and the outcome you're trying to achieve. But broadly, that's the idea. If we understand how different behaviors were driven by different motivations, we can, given different scenarios, understand where you're best positioned to win and what decisions you can make that will put you in that best position. Right. Are there any other?
Yeah, there's one that just came in. With data analytics and more products gathering customer feedback and analytics in real time, how important should that data be stacked against other analyzing strategies at that early point in the strategy process?
So, I mean, in my perspective, I would say this approach generally is intended to take on as much information as possible. So in terms of other analyzing strategies, I think most of them offer additional information and perspective, which can and should be brought into the understanding. I think the various analyzing strategies help to understand potential opportunities through other lenses, such as risk factors or your current competitive positioning. There's lots of different analyzing strategies. I think I don't necessarily see many of them in competition off the top of my head, but things that can help to challenge the future scenarios you're envisioning, help be comprehensive in terms of your consideration of what you can deliver to a customer and what could be considered within your purview as a company. So I think generally we would encourage diverse points of view and diverse ways of thinking, and bringing those lenses in, and not necessarily be putting them in competition with one another. But maybe I'm not thinking of the type you are. Ryan, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, and I think this is where we'll see that consumers, they are very good at expressing what they want now. But as we discussed earlier in the lecture, in the webinar, if we want to predict what's the future, if we want to create a more disruptive innovation, consumer might not be the best source, and not the only source that we need to get in order to create that disruptive leap. So we'll look at the different technology, different consumer trends, and other as a source of inspiration to create a disruptive innovation. So real-time analytics, very useful, help us to respond in a very fast manner. But if we want to look into 10 years, we need to understand what is the real usage of that real-time analytics towards the future. I think that's all the questions that we have. Thank you so much. Yes, a lot of great questions, and I enjoy answering those questions. And if you guys, if you all have any additional questions or comments or feedback, you have our emails. Feel free to send us the emails, and we can get into discussion later.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And we know this is a very hectic time for many of you. We really appreciate you taking the time out to listen. Great questions. It's fun to answer them. It's even more fun to have a discussion back and forth. So please reach out to us, and let's continue the discussion where it can go both ways. Thanks so much.
Thank you.